Hello, hello. Welcome back to So What, the Imperfect Sewist. This is a podcast where I talk about your beginner sewing journey and help you through as you continue to master the art of sewing. So, today I want to talk about the top 10 terms that a beginner sewist should know so that you can continue on your sewing journey and continue to thrive. Um, Okay. All right. So a lot of times when you're looking at a sewing pattern or you're looking at something else, you may see something that says, create a notch here or allow for a 6 inch seam allowance or, like there are a lot of things. Do something on the raw edge or on the grain line, and these are things that you hear all the time, and you may not necessarily know what that means. So today I'm going to break it all down for you and help you get started. Now, feel free to save this because the last one is going to be one that will help change and really truly transform your beginner sewing journey so that the next time you go to the store like Joann's or Michael's and you pick up a sewing pattern, you know what it truly means and you're able to stick with it. So first, for those who are just joining me, my name is Joy. I have been sewing now for multiple decades. I love it. I teach it, and it's something that I am pretty passionate about. I do believe that sewing has become a dying art, but it is not one that should be dying. I'm a firm believer in the lots of the benefits that comes with learning to sew and the things it's done. Let me just give you an example. During the pandemic, before they started doing the N95 masks, N94, and all the other different types of masks, um, there was a big issue with having masks. There were shortages, and before that could that before we started getting the supplies in, a lot of people ended up having to make cloth masks, and to make those it required sewing. And this was one situation where people didn't think that sewing mattered, and all of a sudden sewing became a thing. I was sewing a lot of masks during that time. I was selling a lot of them. And some people, when they think about sewing, they say the first thing that comes to their mind is that, oh, this is something that old people do. I actually saw a meme the other day on TikTok where this lady says, I walked into a store, into a laundromat, and the lady who was asking me said she wanted to take my measurement, but she looked like she was in her 20s. I was looking for a 70 something year old, a man. And I'm like, well, that's because the next generation is here and they should be ready to start their sewing journey as well. So I say all this to say, don't get intimidated by the age thing. Don't feel like if you don't know, like if you don't know, you're not going to be able to sew. And don't feel like you have to start on day one like the people who have already been sewing for multiple years. I want to help you start out as a beginner sewist and then eventually continue to grow and thrive in your sewing journey. And some of these things I'm talking about today are things that will actually help you with that. So along those lines, let's go ahead and get started. The first term I wanted to talk about is a seam allowance. Now, this is one that should be very easy. This is basically the space between the edge of the fabric and the line of stitching. So if you think about your fabric, and let's say you have something fully the edge, which will be the end of the fabric. Let's look, even looking at your sleeves, you see that there's a distance between the edge and where the stitch actually goes. The distance, that gap there, is what you call the seam allowance. Why do you need a seam allowance? Well, because it matters for, accuracy. It helps you ensure that, if mistakes happen, you can adjust for it. If the garment needs to be adjusted over time, that can be done. It also is very important because it helps ensure that it gives the garment a little bit of an allowance for adjustments, either later on down the line or even as you're sewing. Most fabrics come with, like, some fabrics have give, some fabrics do not have give, and if they don't have give, you want to have the option to at least be able to make an adjustment. So seam allowances are very important. A lot of sewing patterns will either tell you a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, a half an inch seam allowance. Everyone's in a whole inch seam allowance, but those are primarily used for either gathers, or they're primarily used for elastic waist and things like that. Either ways, those are very important. So now, you need to know what a seam allowance is, and especially when you're sewing, because it determines the final result of what your project is going to look like. The next thing I wanted to talk about, number two, is the right side versus the wrong side. Now, this is one that can be tricky if you're just starting out. The right side is often the pretty side, or the printed side, or the finished texture side. So if you're looking at a fabric and it looks prettier or brighter or more vibrant, that's usually the right side. And the wrong side is what some people will refer to also as the ugly side. Now, let me just be very clear, because when I first started sewing, I was sewing with Ankara, which is an African print fabric. And in a lot of those cases, the front and back side can look very similar. But if you look very carefully on the fabric, you will see that there is one either writing on the sides, which allows you to understand that one side, if there's no writing on it, then that's the wrong side. The other thing you can do is look for what side looks duller. So if it looks dull, more dull than the other side, then you know that that is the wrong side. And the more vibrant colors is usually the right side. There's some other cotton fabrics that actually makes it so much easier for you, so you don't have to try to figure out what side is right and what side is wrong. But if you are someone who has a print that has it on both sides, just look for what side looks more vibrant and what side looks less vibrant. The right side would be the one that looks more vibrant and more colorful, and the wrong side will be the one that has that it looks a little duller. So that's just a way to know what the differences are. So whenever you're doing things, and in a lot of cases, when you're looking at patterns or you're looking at different things, you will see where it says right sides together. That just means that you want both vibrant sides, especially if you're working with two pieces of fabric, facing each other. You want to create a sandwich, and the wrong side is always on the other on the outside facing you, or it would say right side down, which means the pretty side is down and the wrong side is up. There are some patterns that like involves like mixing and matching and things like that, which may vary a little bit, but for the most part, that is what you will see often being referred to as in, right sides together, wrong side up, or right side down. So you might also see this as RST on a fabric or on a pattern, which just means right side together. Hopefully that helps. And if you have questions as I'm going through any of these, please feel free to leave a comment. I am always more than happy to provide additional information on those. Like I said, I love to teach. I've been doing it for years, and I love to talk about sewing. So if there's anything I can do to help people, I'm also learning. Like every day I find something new. And I love the fact that TikTok has opened up this new world where you have a lot of people who really, truly love sewing and want to truly get to know it. So as I continue to grow, I want to share my journey. I want to share the good, the bad, the not so great, and just things that that have helped me over the years and could potentially help you as well. I call myself the imperfect sewist. And there's a reason for that, because I know that sewing can be a journey. I have had lives where I completely messed up. That's the thing. Like I found that whenever I have a live and I am actually sewing, I can't do a lot of talking because I tend to get a little discombobulated when I'm doing that. So I am trying to be better at it. I try to write a script or do sticky notes on my screen so that I know exactly what I'm doing. But in any case, so that's the first one I was talking about is the seam allowance. The second one is the right side versus the wrong side. The next one is a back stitch. Now, sewing, this is basically where you sew a few stitches forward and then a few stitches backwards. This is a way to lock in your stitch. Most modern day machines actually have this feature auto built into them. And in some cases, like my machines, I realized the other day that, I had turned it off. In some cases, you have to turn it off. In some case, and I turned it off because out of force of habit, because I always backstitch whenever I am sewing. But that's not always the case for a lot of people. Doing a front and a back stitch, so this is where you go forward a few inches, like 1 or 2 or 3 inches. I mean, 1 or 2 or 3 stitches, and then back stitch 1 or 2 or 3 stitches. It's just basically a way to lock your stitches in. I do this because that's how I was taught. But if you're using one of the more modern machines, you may not need to do that. So back stitching is one that I feel like, with the newer machines, it probably will eventually go away. But for now, at least you know what it is. And you typically would do it at the start and the end of a stitch. It locks the thread so the seam doesn't unravel. Now, even after I've said that, I will add a caveat. And the caveat is if you're doing gathers, you're working with elastic thread, this is one where you do not need a back stitch. Or if you're working with some of the decorative design stitches on your machine. In some cases, you don't need to do a back stitch because it actually ruins the look and feel of it. So you might want to just finish it out with a straight stitch if you want to do that. But when it comes to working with elastic, you do not need to do a back stitch because when you're sewing, you do want the ability to pull your threads on both sides, which means you don't need it to lock. Once you lock it, it then becomes impossible to actually make the adjustment for your elastic stitching. So in that case, you don't need to do a back stitch. So we've talked about the seam allowance. We've talked about the right and wrong side. We've talked about the back stitch. Now let's talk about raw edges. A raw edge is basically the cut that's unfinished on the unfinished edge of the fabric, which is often prone to fraying. So if you're working with cotton is usually pretty good about where if you're working with it, depending on which ones or where you bought it or and things like that, it pretty much holds. Like if you have a good 100% cotton, it will hold for you. It doesn't fray as much. And then, like your threads will stay in place. Now, if you're working with other things like satin, I sew a lot of hair bonnets in my business, and I use satin fabrics to sew my bonnets. When you get to the edges, you'll notice that some of the edges, like the threads, do tend to come apart. And for some things like that, using pink and shears does help control that. However, you need to know what the raw edge is and how the raw edge aligns with your fabric, because the raw edge can also distort how you're sewing. So if you have threads that are fraying and you know the direction it's fraying, and you want to make sure that when you're sewing against that, so that your threads stay in place and they don't keep falling apart. Also, you want to have finished edges, or you want to finish your edges whenever you have fraying ends. And to do that, like I said, you can use pink and shears, you can use a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. I love the use of pink and shears, but there's a good and bad to using pink and shears. On the one hand, I think I did a podcast a few weeks ago where I talked about the benefits or the values or the things that you need that are gimmicks versus the things that you don't necessarily need as a beginner sewist. While I did mention the pink and shears are not necessarily things you need when you're starting out, I said that because most people who are starting out on their sewing journey typically start with just cotton. If you're starting with pure cotton, like, you're not going to have a lot of fabrics that have raw edges. If you follow my guidance and you go to, let's say, to a thrift store, or you're using a set of bed sheets to start your sewing journey, you're not going to have a lot of fabrics that have fray in there. So in those cases, you really don't need pink and shears. However, once you start to sew and you're exposing yourself to a few more different types of fabrics, that is when the pink and shears will come in. I do use a serger every now and then. I have a serger, which is usually nice, but a serger is one of those things that I feel like it's something that you will need when you're more an intermediate slash a very highly skilled sewist, as in you have mastered the art of sewing, and pink, this is just, I want to add or show off my edges and things like that. So that is kind of like the top tier. I would, if I had to rate it, I would say pink and shears is for beginners. The next level will be doing zigzag stitches, and then the next level will be using a serger. So 3 tiers depending on your sewing skills. Pink and shears are good. They help you along your journey. Zigzag stitches are also good. The reason some people don't do zigzag stitches is because sometimes it also involves having to fold, which also may interfere with your seam allowance. So you have to understand and factor in the seam allowance versus the zigzag stitches seam allowance. If you have like a 1/4 of an inch zigzag stitch width, then you have to factor that into whatever it is you're sewing. So again, that's why I say it's kind of mid-tier. Once you have mastered the art of sewing and all of that, using zigzag stitches would work just great, especially if you don't have a set of pink and shears. However, pink and shears are also a good thing to have if you want to create some decorative designs on the edges of your fabric to prevent it from fraying. So excuse me. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the selvage. So this is number 5, the selvage. The selvage is the finished, tightly woven edges on the edge of a bolt or fabric that wouldn't fray. So if you go back 3, points ago where I was talking about African print fabrics, and on one end you will have the name and things like that, the name of the fabric or the material or the colors, and you've probably seen it and just never thought about it. Where it's just a woven edge. It looks typically what you will see, especially in the American market, is you will see it like it's either white or it is off white, and it's just like a little thin strip on the edge that has a writing on it. This is a tightly woven edge on the side, and this edge does not fray. You have writing, and people use it to tell you what color it is or what threads will go with the particular color of the fabric you're working with. That is called a selvage. And you don't use this as part of your project. Oftentimes, people will cut it out. It shrinks differently than the rest of your fabric because, in a lot of cases, it's meant to hold your fabric together on the ends. So you typically will only find the selvage on the ends of a fabric bolt or on the ends of your fabric piece. That is not something that becomes part of your sewing journey, but you need to be aware of it when you're cutting. So when you start to cut your fabric, you do not factor in the selvage. You have to take the selvage off and then count from the edge to wherever you need to account for. And in my experience, a selvage is usually about a quarter of an inch with writing on it on the very edge. So always make sure that you're looking, if something you're working on has that selvage on it, you want to make sure you take it out. And then when you start counting or you start measuring, you're measuring from the edge after you've taken it out. And again, it doesn't shrink. It's usually a different texture, and you can feel it. It's a little, it has a little bit of a grain to it if you feel it between your fingers. So that's what it's there for. It's there to hold your fabric pieces together. It's kind of there to ensure that if you have fabric that might fray, it keeps it intact. And it's also just a way, again, for writing about the fabric, either the colors, either the direction, either the thread colors, like different things. So I know people don't necessarily spend a lot of time looking at it, but it is one that actually does provide a lot of value if that is something if you want to learn a little more about fabrics. So if you do think that this is something you want me to expand on more and show you some examples for any of these, please leave it in the comments and I will be sure to do that. So now we've talked about a few other things. Let's go and now talk about the grain line. The grain line is the direction of the threads. So just like I was talking about fraying and understanding what fraying is and how that works, you also want to understand the grain line for your fabric. The straight grain runs parallel to your selvage. So like I said, the selvage is meant to ensure that your fabric does not fray. So think about it. So if you have your selvage on the top end, your grain line will probably be running this way. If you have it this way, your grain line is probably running this way. It is just parallel. And that the reason it's there again is because once you take it off, or once you take off your selvage, the grain line, the threads can come off. So you want to understand where your grain line is. The selvage is a good way when you think about it. Okay, so this is where my selvage is. That means that my thread or my grain line is running parallel to it. So parallel is just going like this or like this, depending on the location of your selvage. Now, fabrics behave differently depending on the grain, so it's also very important. There's some the reason I always recommend working with fabrics from a thrift store, starting out with that and things you have around the house, is because when you do that, you're often working with fabrics that are easier to rip apart and that are easier for you to see and understand what the grain line looks like. So I do teach a class at Out School where I talk about different types of fabrics, what they do. It's part of my beginner sewing class, and I spent a lot of time, almost a half hour, going over this because it's very important as you sew. If you're sewing against your grain line, like the way the fabric moves and the way it shifts can vary if you are not cognizant, if you're not aware of how your grain line ties to, how the direction your grain line is going and how you're either cutting or how you are actually sewing along your fabric. It can lead to what you call pull, where parts, like in some parts of your fabric, it looks like it has bunching. That's because you're going against the grain line. When you work with the grain line, things tend to be smoother and work together with you. And when you work against the grain line, because you're actually kind of forcing it into a different direction, it can sometimes have a little bit of what you might call, or so you might see, or looks like puckering on your fabric piece. So I do think that it's a good idea to always know what the grain line is and where it is and what it looks like. So next, that was my 6th point. Now let's talk about the bias. Now, the bias is the diagonal direction of the fabric, which is usually a 45-degree angle. Fabric is much stretchier on the bias, and using this is your advantage for a drape, but be careful when you're sewing with it. Now, typically a bias is what you want to be very aware of if you're making things like a satin top, like a camisole, or if you're making a hair bonnet or things like that. The bias does play in there because the way you put things, the way you cut things, the way you sew on it will determine how your fabric will drape. If you want a drapier fabric, then you want to work along your bias and making sure that it's on the right wavelength, for lack of a better word. It goes in the right direction diagonally so that everything looks more cohesive. So while a bias is not necessarily something I would say you have to be extra cognizant of or extra aware of, it is something that as you continue to grow in your sewing journey, this is something that you want to continue to work on and be aware of. And especially if you plan on working with silk or satin or drapey fabrics that are very, very thin or lightweight, you want to understand how that works because the bias will determine how it will fall. I'm sure you've seen some camisoles or dresses, satin dresses, where it feels like it's not necessarily falling or draping, but instead it is like it feels a little slanted. The reason it feels slanted is because whoever was sewing it was not taking into consideration the bias, so it kind of looks a little off. Once you work with the bias when you're sewing, everything drapes and flows much more evenly, much nicer, and it makes a difference in your sewing journey. But I find that biases, when you're working with a bias, it's more important to be aware of them when it is a thinner or more lightweight fabric. Okay, next, let's talk about the hem. And the process of finishing the bottom edge of a garment or item by folding it up and stitching down to hide the raw edge is what you will call the hem. So most clothing items, most items you still will have a hem. Okay, so the hem is just basically where you fold and then fold again. And I find that if you are someone who prefers, so let's go back a few where I was talking about finishing the edges against fraying and either using a serger, pinking shears, or doing a zigzag stitch. Now, if you are using pinking shears, you do not necessarily need to have the hem folded. If you're using a serger, you don't necessarily need to have the hem folded because that is the whole purpose of using the serger. It kind of helps to finish up along the edge, so you don't have to deal with that. But if you are using a zigzag stitch, I do still recommend having the hem folded, and that's why I say again, zigzag stitches is intermediate because you need to have a full and a solid understanding of the seam allowance from the edge of the fabric to where your seam goes. So the hem is just basically after you fold what that looks like. I like decorative hems. I find that they are cute. I think that it's also a great way to kind of just show your artistic abilities, your creativity. It's always a good idea to have that. So a hem does look nice, edges. If this is a great opportunity to kind of showcase the different types of decorative stitches your machine has. But a hem is important. I do recommend press as you go. I actually just saw a TikTok video earlier today where someone said, oh, you know what, I sewed this and I was completely off. The reason they were off is because they did not have the smooth, clean allowance for when they folded the fabric and they sewed along the hem. So don't make an assumption. You can use a magnetic seam guide if you do need that, just to make sure that when you're creating your hem, you don't have some wider hems and some shorter or narrower hems, because that will also impact what your fabric looks like when you're done. So a hem is also very important as you continue along your sewing journey. So basically the hem, it's just the fold over and the second fold where you stitch along it just to make sure that everything sits flat. Now, coming to our 9th point, pressing. Not ironing, pressing. And I can do a whole series on the different, or not a whole series, but excuse me, a whole podcast episode on the difference between ironing and pressing. And maybe I will do that. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do one of those. If you have been following me for any period of time, you know iron is not my thing. I don't like it, and you could probably blame this on the fact that as a young kid, I'm an older girl, one of the older kids in the order of my family, and I had to learn to iron earlier, and it's never been my thing, but it is an important part of sewing. You cannot get away from ironing, and you cannot get away from pressing your seams. So I'm just going to use my hands to demonstrate the difference. Ironing, when people say go ahead and iron something, when you're ironing, this is what you're doing. Okay, so let's assume this is a piece of fabric and this is your hands. This is how you iron. Okay, when you're pressing, you're lifting and you're placing the iron down on the fabric. Okay, like so. And instead of sliding back and forth, you're pressing as you go. And this is the difference in when you're sewing. So sewing, when you see some patterns or some different things, it will tell you to go ahead and press your seams. Press your seams means you take your iron and you're pressing along it. You're not ironing like this. You're pressing along it. Now that also comes in handy if you're working with, let's say you're working with like some of the, if you're making designs or you wanted to add some backing to your fabrics or different things that allows your fabric to have a little more structure. You will need to press, not iron, because ironing is not going to allow the sticky part to sit on your fabric piece. You need to press to get the glue and everything to kind of adhere to each other and to stay together. So pressing is what you primarily use when you're doing sewing versus ironing. Ironing is good for when you're ironing your garment and all those things, but pressing is what you need as part of your sewing journey. And then we've come to the last one. Like I told you, this one here is going to transform everything you do, and it's important to understand it. And if you're anything like me and you started sewing, let me just say, this is what you're going to use. Every single sewist I know has used this. What is it? Seam ripping. I know you probably didn't expect that, but let me tell you something. I have not, and like I said, I have been sewing for many years, multiple decades. I'm not going to tell y'all how old I am, but I've been sewing multiple decades. And the seam ripper is one thing that every single person I know who sews has used. I don't know of anybody who can say they do things and they sew consistently and finish out their projects and they never use a seam ripper. I use a seam ripper all the time. Every sewist out there uses a seam ripper. Every tailor I know uses a seam ripper because it is an important and an integral part of your sewing journey. It's your best friend. It's a small tool that's used to cut and remove stitches, and getting a good and sturdy seam ripper will make your life so much easier. I have people who follow me on TikTok, and the other day someone said, "Oh my gosh, I just had to seam rip my entire project and start all over again." Yes, it's not fun. I totally know the feeling, but a seam ripper makes things go faster, ensures that you're not ripping through your fabric. It comes with a ball and another edge that ensures that when you're using your seam ripper, things don't come through. I will be more than happy to do an episode on using your seam ripper and how it actually aids in your sewing journey. I'm also one of those people that also use my seam ripper sometimes just as the way to cut the thread on my projects. So a seam ripper is so important. And if you haven't used your seam ripper today, you probably aren't pushing your creative boundaries. So every sewist uses this tool, like I said. Don't feel ashamed. Don't feel like you have to take take apart your project. It means you're a failure. Actually, it means you're doing something right because it means you have learned the path that might work and a path that might not work. So having that seam ripper, it's a game changer. It is the one thing that I always encourage people to have handy whenever they're going along their sewing journey. So now that you have all of these vocabulary of things that you'll be doing and the 10 terms that you need to know as a beginner sewist, don't feel like you have to be perfect. Like I keep saying, I am the imperfect sewist. If you watch any of my lives, you likely have seen that I have made mistakes, and I actually take comfort in those mistakes because it definitely tells me this path works, this path doesn't work. If I'm distracted, I can do this. If I'm not distracted, I can do this. So sewing is a skill. It's not a talent. It's not a talent you're born with. It's one that you learn over time. And and one that you want to continue to practice with. Start with simple projects, make a card wallet or a tote bag, which we did last week, and focus on just one of these terms at a time. Don't feel like you have to know all of it all at the same time. Things did not come to me all at once. I had to learn and grow each day as I continued my sewing journey. So I hope this has helped clear up some of the mysteries behind the machine. If you have a favorite sewing term that wasn't on this list, please drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for my upcoming tutorials. And if you're looking for more inspiration, be sure to head over to my website to check out my latest patterns. Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next episode.